Ted Cruz crowned himself a genius, parading an IQ of 170 while humiliating Jasmine Crockett. But his pride hid a devastating truth. The test was never about genius, it was about decline. One revelation turned the hearing into a political earthquake, and Cruz crumbled in front of millions. What did Jasmine reveal that made him fall with no return? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The hearing was live, broadcast into millions of homes across America. It did not feel like politics, it felt like a cage fight under blinding lights. Cameras zoomed in, reporters shouted over one another, flashes burst like gunfire. Every second crackled with tension, as if the room itself might explode. This was not just testimony, it was survival in front of the nation. Ted Cruz sat at the center, one leg thrown over the other, his body language dripping with arrogance. He smirked, savoring the stage, and leaned into the microphone with the confidence of a man untouchable. Then he fired his opening shot, voice sharp and cutting. I heard Ms. Crockett claims to be smart, but her IQ must be somewhere around 90. A person like that thinks she can challenge me? The words detonated in the chamber, gasps colliding with nervous laughter, reporters scrambling to capture the insult before it faded. Cruz doubled down, chest puffed, declaring again his supposed brilliance. I have an IQ of 170 genius level. His tone was dripping with mock pride, his smirk daring anyone to dispute him. The arrogance hung in the air like smoke. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett did not flinch, her lips pressed into a thin line, her hand resting firmly on a thick leather folder. She did not answer. She did not need to. The silence was her weapon, and it promised that Cruz's moment of triumph would not last. The silence from Jasmine in the opening moments was not weakness. It was the calm before the storm. And Cruz, mistaking restraint for fear, seized the stage with both hands. He leaned into the microphone, his voice dripping with false gravitas, and began his performance. I am a rare genius, he boomed, his words echoing across the chamber. America should consider itself lucky to have me. The arrogance rolled off him in waves, each sentence crafted to inflate his own legend. He spoke like a man convinced that the nation's future rested on his shoulders alone, daring anyone in the room to challenge the claim. But Cruz wasn't finished. He turned his gaze toward Jasmine, narrowing his eyes into sharp points. The smirk returned, heavier now, sharpened into cruelty. And then we have Ms. Crockett, he sneered, drawing out her name like an insult. A low IQ radical, a noisy pretender, someone who screams just to get viral attention. His words struck like daggers, slicing through the tense air. Each jab was deliberate, designed to humiliate her, to reduce her into a caricature before she could even speak. The cameras caught everything, every sneer, every exaggerated shrug of his shoulders, every gleam of superiority in his stare. The networks loved it, cutting close-ups of Cruz's face as though he were an actor in a courtroom drama. His eyes gleamed with the smug certainty of a man convinced he was untouchable. His smile stretched wider each time he delivered another insult, feeding off the gasps, the whispers, and the scribbling of pens on reporters' pads. Behind him, the supporters roared. They clapped. They whistled. They shouted, "That's right," as if Cruz had scored a knockout blow in a boxing ring. The sound shook the walls, filling the chamber with a wave of crude approval. For those in his corner, his arrogance wasn't shameful, it was intoxicating. They treated his ridicule of Jasmine as a triumph, a public execution of dignity on live television. Yet on the other side of the aisle, the atmosphere was different. His opponents sat stiffly, jaws clenched, their eyes locked on Cruz with silent fury. They didn't speak, but their silence was heavy, as if held down by the weight of decorum. No one interrupted. No one shouted back. Their restraint made the tension sharper, like the drawn breath before an explosion. And in the middle of it all sat Jasmine Crockett, her face calm, her eyes unwavering. She did not flinch when he mocked her, did not blink when he called her names. She pressed her lips together, holding back a reply, her silence louder than his roar. Her hand still rested on the leather folder at her side, steady, deliberate, almost ceremonial. She wasn't ignoring him, she was waiting for the right moment, waiting for the perfect strike, While Cruz drowned in his own arrogance, Jasmine knew something he didn't. Silence can be deadlier than words. The chamber was still vibrating from Cruz's tirade, his insults lingering like smoke in the air. The applause from his supporters had barely settled when Jasmine Crockett finally rose to her feet. The tension snapped as every camera swiveled toward her, the sound of shutters and keyboards filling the silence. She stood tall, her voice clear, calm, but edged with steel. "If Senator Cruz is so proud of himself," she said, each word deliberate, "then let the American people know exactly what kind of test he actually took." The room froze, the challenge hanging like a blade. Cruz leaned back in his chair, lips curling into another smirk, his arrogance on full display. He gave a short laugh, loud enough to echo, shaking his head as if the idea was absurd. "You don't have the ability to understand what I've been through," he sneered, his tone dripping with contempt. "You wouldn't even recognize the level of testing I've endured." His words drew chuckles from a few loyalists behind him, but their laughter sounded hollow under the weight of the moment. The cameras zoomed in tighter, capturing the flicker of unease he tried so hard to hide. Jasmine didn't flinch. With slow, deliberate movement, she reached down and pulled the thick leather folder onto the desk before her. The sound of the clasp snapping open was louder than expected in the hushed chamber, a sound that made heads turn. Every eye followed her hands as she spread the pages out, the paper glowing white under the fluorescent lights. "Here it is," she said firmly, her tone leaving no room for doubt. "The actual test results." A ripple of shock shot through the audience, and the reporters leaned forward like hunters scenting blood. The reveal hit like a thunderclap. It wasn't a high-level IQ exam. It wasn't Mensa. It wasn't Stanford Binet. It wasn't even Wechsler, the gold standard for measuring intelligence. What Jasmine held in her hands was something entirely different: the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, or MoCA, a screening tool used around the world not to measure genius, but to detect early dementia, mild cognitive impairment, and memory loss. It asked questions so simple that they were given to patients in nursing homes and doctors' offices every single day. Jasmine flipped to the first page, letting the cameras capture the heading in bold letters: MoCA, Montreal Cognitive Assessment. She raised her eyes and spoke directly into the microphone. "This is not an intelligence test. This is a cognitive screening tool designed to check if someone might be slipping into dementia." Her voice carried across the chamber, amplified by the speakers, searing into the minds of everyone watching live. The contrast was brutal, Cruz's claim of IQ 170 colliding head-on with a test that asked people to draw clocks and identify animals. The room reacted instantly. Gasps rippled through the audience, the kind of collective intake of breath that told the story better than words. Members of the press typed furiously, headlines already forming in their minds. The tension was volcanic, every second dragging out like an eternity. Cruz shifted in his chair, his smirk flickering, his jaw tightening, though he tried to hold the mask of superiority. The cameras caught at all the beads of sweat on his forehead, the slight twitch at the corner of his mouth. Jasmine leaned into the microphone, her tone sharp and deliberate. "For the record, the test Senator Cruz took was not an IQ exam. It was the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, known as the MoCA. This is a screening tool, not for measuring genius, but for detecting signs of dementia." She raised the folder, her eyes sweeping the chamber. "What does this test involve? Very simple tasks. For example, patients are asked to recall a short list of common words. They are asked to identify animals from line drawings: a lion, a rhinoceros, a camel. They may be asked to copy a simple cube or to draw a clock showing a specific time, like 10 past 11. Then her voice cut deeper, steady but charged with fire. "These are examples of what's on the MoCA." The noise in the room grew louder: shouts, whispers, and the clicking of camera shutters blending into a storm. It was chaos, controlled only by Jasmine's steady presence at the center. Cruz tried to force another smile, tilting his head as if none of it mattered, but the cameras betrayed him. They caught the stiffness in his posture, the way his fingers gripped the table just a little too tight. He was holding on, but the cracks were showing, and through it all, Jasmine stood unyielding, her voice rising above the storm. This is what the senator is calling proof of his genius, she declared, holding the page aloft so the cameras could zoom in. The words Montreal Cognitive Assessment filled the screens across America. Not a test of brilliance, not a measure of intelligence, a dementia screening. The final word landed like a hammer blow. The audience erupted, gasps giving way to uproar as the weight of her revelation sank in. The smirk was still on Cruz's face, but now it looked brittle, desperate, a mask crumbling under the weight of truth. He tried to laugh again, but the sound was hollow, drowned out by the thunder of the crowd. The game had changed. The battle had shifted, and the nation was watching, breathless, as the facade began to fall apart. With the test exposed for what it was, Jasmine shifted from explanation to proof, raising the folder like a verdict about to be read. She steadied the page beneath the microphones and spoke into the charged air, her tone precise and cold. First item, she said, image, a zebra. Senator Cruz wrote, horse in a striped shirt. Oh no. For a heartbeat, the chamber blinked, and then suddenly the laughter burst short, stunned, guilty rolling from row to row as cameras knifed in for close-ups. The laughter didn't cleanse the tension, it pressurized it. Reporters leaned forward with their recorders as if the words themselves might combust. Cruz adjusted his tie and forced a smirk, but a nerve twitched along his jaw. Supporters tried to clap it away, an awkward sputter of bravado against the rising noise. Across the dais, several members exchanged looks that said more than speeches. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She let the silence return before she cut again. Next task, the clock, she announced, turning the sheet so the lens could drink it in. The instruction is simple. Draw a clock showing 10 past 11. She did not add a lecture. She didn't need one. Everyone there understood instantly. Senator Cruz placed nearly all the numbers on one side of the circle. Not balanced, not readable, just crammed to the edge. The laughter collapsed into a hush that sounded like fear learning a new shape. Phones lifted, the boom mics hovered, and even the air seemed to hold position. You could hear pen tips tick against desks, an impatient metronome under the fluorescent glare. A cameraman mouthed, "You're kidding," to no one in particular. Cruz's smile held, but it had hardened into something brittle, like glass under a torch. Jasmine turned the page again, the paper whispering like a fuse. She did not rush. The room did that for her. Final detail for the record, she said, crisp as a gavel. Image, a rooster. Senator Cruz wrote, Eagle baby. A ripple of disbelief moved through the gallery, gasps meeting nervous, choking laughs. One staffer covered his mouth, another stared at the ceiling, as if the tiles might explain it. The boom of shutters became a storm. The evidence did not shout, it simply stood there and let the room do the shouting for it. What began as snickering now stalled, the chamber tilting from spectacle to reckoning. The committee members sat very still, eyes set on the page in Jasmine's hand. No one reached for the microphone. No one offered to intervene. Every close-up drew tighter on Cruz's face, red, rising from collar to cheekbone, the tendons standing in his neck. His fingers spread on the table, then balled into fists. The silence felt surgical. Producers in the broadcast trucks cut to split screens, Jasmine on the left, Cruz on the right, letting the country watch his face as each word landed. On the Chiron, editors typed mocha details, then hesitated, then added not IQ test, the letters burning across the bottom of the feed. In the gallery, a donor's aide tapped out a frantic text, then another, retreating into the aisle. A committee counsel bent toward a microphone and thought better of it, pulling back, eyes fixed on the page. Somewhere in the back, a pen rolled off a notebook and clattered like a dropped shell casing. No one moved to pick it up. Jasmine's hands were steady, her posture unshaken, the folder held like a warrant. Her eyes never left Cruz. She didn't blink, didn't smirk, didn't gloat. She simply waited, letting the evidence breathe while the room suffocated. Cruz's chair creaked as he shifted, then creaked again, a small mammal noise in a cage of microphones. He wet his lips, pressed them together, and tried on the smirk one more time. It failed to arrive. Then Cruz snapped. He leaned forward, eyes flaring, and his palm hit the wood with a report that jolted the front row. "That is nonsense," he snarled, voice shredding the hush. "I am a genius, and you are a cheap nobody clawing for fame." "That is nonsense. I am a genius, and you are a cheap nobody clawing for fame." The words ricocheted off marble and metal, ugly and loud, as if volume could bury evidence. The chamber was still reeling from the mockery of Cruz's answers when he lunged for a counterattack. His hand shot out toward the folder in Jasmine's grip, finger jabbing like an accusation. "This is a fraud," he shouted, his voice cracking but carrying across the microphones. "She forged those papers, and she knows it." The words slammed into the air, triggering a ripple of noise from his allies seated behind him. The energy shifted as he doubled down, trying to turn defense into offense. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing, and delivered his insult with venom. "Ms. Crockett, your IQ isn't even high enough to understand the difference between a cognitive test and a genius test." The phrase dripped with condescension, designed for sound bites and replay, a deliberate attempt to stain her reputation. A few of his supporters clapped weakly, others laughed too loud, desperate to keep the momentum alive. But the smirk on Cruz's face twitched, his eyes betraying what his mouth refused to admit he was rattled. The volume of his voice climbed as he tried to seize control of the narrative. "This is all political theater," he barked, slamming a palm on the desk. "She is trying to drag my name through the mud with lies." The boom of his voice filled the chamber, but it no longer sounded commanding. It sounded panicked. The cameras caught it, zooming in on the sweat starting to form along his temples. The tightening of his jaw as he forced himself to keep smiling. His words grew sharper, louder. But the more he raised his voice, the more the cracks showed. Jasmine did not flinch. Her posture was steady, her expression calm, almost surgical. She waited for his shouting to crest, then stepped into the silence he left behind. With measured precision, she lifted the leather-bound folder high enough for the cameras to focus on it. The room hushed instinctively, drawn by the gravity of her movement. Her hand was steady, her gaze locked on Cruz as though daring him to look away. She spoke clearly, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "This is a document signed by Dr. Michael Harrington, the attending physician at Walter Reed Medical Center. The date is recorded April 14th, 2018. The signature is right here, verified and authenticated. Every detail is official, every word is documented." Her tone was simple, almost conversational, but in that simplicity lay its devastating power. She angled the folder toward the press row, the embossed seal glinting under the lights, the pages magnified on every screen. Reporters zoomed in, the doctor's signature sprawled in blue ink, the date stamped in bold at the bottom. The evidence was no longer abstract, it was alive on the page, undeniable, and the chamber felt the weight of it pressing down. The effect was immediate. Reporters surged forward, shutters clicking like gunfire. Screens in the gallery magnified the physician's signature, the hospital letterhead, the official date stamp. The evidence wasn't shouted, it was shown. "The American people have the right to know," Jasmine declared, her eyes never leaving Cruz's. The words landed heavy, their weight undeniable, stripping his accusations of air. For a moment, no one moved. The room was caught between the force of Cruz's bluster and the precision of Jasmine's proof. His breathing grew heavier, chest rising and falling faster than he wanted the cameras to see. He tried to smirk again, but the expression faltered, collapsing under the pressure. His eyes darted to the folder, then to the reporters, then back to Jasmine. The certainty he wore like armor was slipping away. And still she stood, unshaken, the folder raised like a shield of truth. She didn't raise her voice, didn't trade insult for insult. She simply showed the record, and the record spoke louder than any accusation. The power of the moment belonged to her now, and the chamber knew it. The chamber was tense, reporters frozen mid-keystroke, the cameras locked on Jasmine as she flipped to the final page. Her fingers traced the margin before she leaned into the microphone. Her voice was calm, deliberate, carrying into every corner of the packed hall. "Physician's note," she read, her tone steady. "The patient shows signs of confusion and difficulty placing numbers correctly on the clock." The words hung in the air like a verdict, heavy and sharp. The effect was immediate. The chamber seemed to stop breathing, a collective gasp swallowed into silence. Even the rustle of paper and the whir of cameras halted for a beat. Every set of eyes turned to Ted Cruz. He sat stiff, face tightening, his forced smirk slipping as the weight of the words pressed down. Supporters shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether to clap or stay quiet. The stillness was suffocating, as though the entire nation was leaning closer to hear what would come next. Jasmine did not rush. She closed the folder with a soft but decisive snap, the sound amplified by the silence. She lifted her chin, eyes locked on Cruz, her expression carved from steel. Her voice was no longer just steady, it was surgical, cutting with precision. "Senator Cruz," she said, her words slow, each one measured. "This is not just confusion. This is deception." The declaration hit the microphones and reverberated like a strike of thunder. Reporters leaned in as she pressed forward, her tone unwavering. "This is a lie told to the public, an illusion you planted to shield yourself from the truth." Her hand rested firmly on the closed folder, a symbol of finality, as if she had sealed his fate inside it. "And today," she continued, her eyes never leaving his, "it ends." The simplicity of the line made it more devastating, a blade sharper because it was bare. The chamber erupted not with cheers, not yet, but with the raw energy of shock. Cameras flashed, shutters rapid like machine gun fire. Staffers whispered frantically to one another, phones lighting up across the gallery as texts and calls flew out into the world. Cruz's jaw worked furiously, but his mouth stayed shut, his face caught between rage and panic. The gavel hammered for order, but the sound only added to the chaos. Jasmine didn't look away. She stood rooted to the spot, the folder under her hand, her words still echoing. The scene felt less like politics and more like a trial, one where the sentence had already been written. The entire chamber knew it. The country watching knew it. In the silence that followed, Cruz's myth of genius cracked wide open, exposed under the relentless light of truth. And Jasmine Crockett had been the one to deliver the blow. And with those words delivered, she pressed the button that made them real. The monitors behind the dais flared to life, audio leveling bars dancing as a high-definition image snapped into focus. "Play the clip," Jasmine said, and the room fell into a heavy, braced silence. The timestamp burned in the corner, the room in the video lit by a single desk lamp and the glow of a laptop. A man in a suit leaned forward, hands steepled, his voice unmistakable even before the camera found his face. The audio was clean enough to cut glass. On screen, Ted Cruz sat across from a physician in a white coat, the man's badge catching the light as he scrolled a document. A banking window popped over the paperwork, the numbers big and bright, the transfer line reading 5,000 Browners. "Moish." The doctor looked up, eyes wide, then nodded, the cursor hovering over "confirm." Cruz's voice filled the chamber speakers. 5 million to make the result disappear, understood?" The physician swallowed, then replied, "Understood." The clip froze on the wire confirmation, the figure stamped in red, undeniable. Jasmine's voice cut into the silence, steady and deliberate. "This video has been forensically verified," she said, holding the remote like a gavel. "It is 100% authentic. No edits, no filters, no manipulation." She let the words sink in as the monitors replayed the transfer, the doctor's nod, Cruz's voice. "This is real, and the American people deserve to see it exactly as it happened." The cameras in the hearing room swung instantly to Cruz, locking onto him with surgical precision. He sat rigid, shoulders tight, jaw clenched so hard a tendon jumped in his neck. Anger flared across his face, but confusion followed it, dulling the heat with a flash of panic. His hands, flat on the table a moment before, curled until the knuckles blanched. He tried to speak and couldn't, the sound catching somewhere between breath and denial. The microphones waited like a firing squad. The gallery did not cheer, it inhaled. Reporters froze mid-keystroke, then exploded into motion, fingers flying as the clip replayed on loop. Producers cut the feed into split screens, Cruz's face live on the right, the damning footage on the left. His myth of IQ 170 cracked wide open, shattered beyond repair by the weight of evidence that was now proven, certified, and undeniable. And in that breathless beat, the duel ended without a shot. This was the kill shot, and everyone in the room knew it. The clip freezes on the wire confirmation, and the room tilts into motion. Reporters erupt like a percussion line, keys clacking, trackpads tapping, phones lighting up as push alerts fly to editors and homepages. Headsets crackle in the press row. Run the banner verified footage, 5 million transfer. Producers carve the moment into lower thirds and live tickers, shaping the narrative in real time. Tweet threads spool out like cables, hashtags bloom across the feeds, and every camera keeps its red light on Jasmine while capturing Cruz in the corner of the frame. The air itself seems to buzz, the kind of charge that means a story has already left the building. Across the dais, lawmakers lean into one another, voices reduced to the hush of side conversations. A committee member covers a microphone with a palm and whispers, eyes never leaving the monitors. Staffers pass folded notes that open with a single word in all caps. Confirmed. On the Republican side, glances skid off Cruz and fall to the wood grain, to pens, to papers that don't need reading. A senior member adjusts his flag pin 3 times and still won't look up. No one volunteers a defense. The party line is eye contact avoided. Cruz senses the drift and claws for the wheel. He jerks forward, shoulders squared, and forces his voice to fill the chamber. "This entire hearing is a disgrace," he thundered, palms slamming against the desk. "A setup orchestrated to smear me in front of the American people." His words cracked across the room, but no one rose to back him. His tone was sharp, but the desperation beneath it bled through. The room doesn't return to him. Camera operators barely pan. Directors keep the split screen locked, his live rage shrinking beside a still frame of the transfer confirmation. In the press box, a producer slices his audio gain. Down a notch, he's yelling, but the mix buries him under the steady hum of the feed. Reporters don't look up from their keyboards. They're busy embedding the freeze frame and the timestamp. A counsel for the majority holds a legal pad in midair, then sets it down without writing a word. On the gallery screens, the image loops. The cursor over confirm, the nod, the number over and over until the repetition becomes its own gavel. The whispers grow teeth. Verified, verified, chain of custody, intact. A staff attorney murmurs into a phone. Yes, the video has been authenticated, and the phrase moves through the rows like a current. 2 Republican aides exchange a look, one grimaces. The other stares straight ahead, jaw locked, hands flat. A backbencher clears his throat to speak and thinks better of it, the words drying before they reach the mic. You can feel careers calculating in real time, and every calculation ends with eyes lowered. The effort to pretend this isn't happening collapses under the weight of all the screens saying it is. Cruz pounds the table again, his voice breaking through the murmurs. "You're all complicit. Every one of you is part of this witch hunt," he barked, eyes flashing from side to side. The accusation sprayed out like shrapnel, but the silence that met him was colder than any rebuttal. He tried again, louder, fists clenched. "This is propaganda, a political hit job, nothing more." His words rang hollow, hanging in the air without an echo. The gavel taps for order and gets none because there is nothing to order back. The momentum has slipped its leash. The sound in the room is a dense weave of keystrokes, hushed legalese, and the faint hiss of live feeds. A Republican committee member touches the bridge of his nose and stares at the seal above the dais as if it can answer him. Another angles her chair away from Cruz by a degree no one will note on paper, but everyone will remember. Somewhere, a phone vibrates on a wood surface. A quick insect buzz that says everything without names. His voice grew hoarse, each word more strained than the last. "This entire thing is a lie," he shouted, pointing a trembling finger toward Jasmine. "It's fabricated from top to bottom." But his voice no longer carried weight. It was just noise on top of the evidence that rolled endlessly across screens. In the hierarchy of truth, shouting was the lowest rung, and Cruz had fallen all the way down. His words kept moving, but they no longer went anywhere. The chamber was already boiling, but outside its walls, the shock had detonated into the bloodstream of America. Within minutes of the clip freezing on the $5 million transfer, headlines were firing across every platform. Push alerts lit up phones like emergency sirens. Cruz video bombshell, bribe allegations surface. Newsrooms shifted into overdrive, anchors cutting into scheduled programming to go live with the feed. What had begun as a hearing now pulsed through every living room in the country. The audience numbers climbed at breakneck speed, 10 million, 15, 20 servers straining as the broadcast smashed through records. The story wasn't being told anymore. It was being lived in real time, an event too raw to script. Back inside, Cruz sensed the ground falling away beneath him. His face was taut, red spreading from his collar up his neck. He leaned into the microphone with the fury of a man cornered, his voice tearing across the chamber. "Crockett is low IQ," he screamed, saliva hitting the metal grill. "This is all a setup, a conspiracy, nothing but a conspiracy." The shout rattled the speakers, but it landed flat, bouncing off the walls without conviction. His words echoed across the chamber, but the echo wasn't agreement, it was emptiness. The cameras did not soften him, they devoured him. Every angle caught the sharp lines of rage, the sweat clinging to his forehead, the tremor riding his jaw. His fists slammed the table again, but the sound only underscored the desperation. On the split screen, his fury stood in stark contrast to Jasmine Crockett, who sat just feet away. She didn't move, didn't blink, her posture unbroken. The folder rested on the desk before her like a crown jewel, untouched but undeniable. While Cruz shouted, she was silent, her composure radiant beneath the lights. The comparison was devastating. Arrogance collapsing beside truth, chaos eclipsed by calm. Viewers watching at home saw what the chamber felt in its bones. On one side, a man unraveling, shouting himself hoarse. On the other, a woman steady as stone, letting the evidence speak for itself. The image itself became the story. Social media feeds flooded with split-screen screenshots, captions writing themselves, screaming versus silence, arrogance versus truth. The contrast hit harder than any soundbite could. The country wasn't just hearing about Cruz's collapse, they were witnessing it live. Reporters in the press row hammered at keyboards, their screens glowing with breaking headlines. Cruz meltdown on live TV. Crockett holds firm. Camera shutters flashed like lightning, freezing his grimace frame by frame for tomorrow's front pages. One journalist whispered to another, "This is Watergate level," and the phrase moved like a contagion down the row. Every network anchor was already framing it as history in the making. The whispers of lawmakers only deepened the humiliation. Democrats watched in rigid silence, their expressions stern but satisfied. Republicans, meanwhile, avoided his gaze as if proximity itself might contaminate them. A senior senator tugged at his tie, eyes fixed on the floor. Another leaned into a staffer, muttering so low the microphones couldn't catch it. No one rose to defend him. The silence from his own side was louder than any protest. Cruz shouted alone, a general without soldiers, his voice cracking in the void. He tried to climb higher, to shout above the avalanche. "This is fake. This is political theater." His voice strained, hoarse from repetition. "The radical left will stop at nothing to destroy me." His hand slammed the desk again, but his knuckles trembled as they landed. The words were the same slogans he had used for years, but tonight they sounded hollow, stripped of their old power. It was like watching a boxer swing wild after the bell had already rung. And still Jasmine sat motionless, unbothered. She did not interrupt. She did not sneer. Her calm was louder than his rage. In one moment, she leaned ever so slightly forward, resting her hands together on the desk, her eyes locked on Cruz. It wasn't aggression, it was presence. The kind of presence that swallows the stage without saying a word. Every lens captured it, and the people watching at home felt it in their bones. The fight was over, even if he hadn't realized it yet. The broadcast numbers continued climbing, anchors marveling live at the tidal wave of viewers. "This is the most-watched congressional hearing in modern history," one analyst said midstream. Clips of Cruz's outburst were already splicing into late-night comedy monologues before the hearing had even adjourned. The hashtag CruzIke scandal soared to the top of Twitter, joined by Crockett exposes the lie. Memes appeared in minutes, Cruz red-faced beside Jasmine, calm-faced, labeled noise versus proof. The internet had judged the duel, and the verdict was brutal. By the time the gavel struck again for order, the chamber had slipped fully into chaos. Phones buzzed nonstop in staffers' pockets. Calls from donors and strategists already pouring in. One aide mouthed to another, "It's over." And they didn't mean the hearing. They meant the career, the myth, the carefully constructed image that had just cracked in front of millions. Jasmine hadn't raised her voice, but she had broken him. The public didn't need to wait for analysis. They had watched it unfold with their own eyes. And then came the final blow from the press. As the networks cut to panels, the headlines solidified in black and white. The New York Times, Cruz IQ scandal shakes Washington. The Washington Post, Crockett exposes the lie. Cable news plastered the phrases across screens, chyrons glowing like verdicts. The story wasn't about numbers or policy anymore. It was about the collapse of a man under the light of evidence. Cruz still shouted, but the shouting no longer mattered. His voice broke into static, drowned by the noise of typing, the clicks of cameras, the churn of the feeds. The last image the public saw that night was not his words. It was his face, red and twisted in fury, beside Jasmine Crockett, calm and unshaken, her hand resting on the folder that had just changed everything. The moment the hearing ended, the real bloodletting began. Phones in Washington didn't stop ringing for hours, chiefs of staff, lobbyists, and donors all whispering into secure lines. For Ted Cruz, it was a free fall that started with a single call from a Fortune 500 donor. The line was brief, almost cold. "We can't be associated with this anymore. Effective immediately, our contributions are suspended." By midnight, 3 more major backers had followed suit. By dawn, the list had grown longer, corporations rushing to distance themselves from the $5 million scandal, now flashing across every screen. Campaign contracts that once funded his rallies and ads were torn apart before breakfast. Emails leaked within a day, statements from PACs that had previously boasted of his intellectual leadership, now calling the situation untenable. One communications director bluntly told a reporter, "No brand wants their logo next to his face right now." The withdrawal wasn't just about money, it was about survival. For donors, reputations mattered more than loyalty, and Cruz had turned toxic overnight. Lobbyists who once fought for meetings with him now refused to return his calls. Staffers described the campaign office as a graveyard, phones ringing without answers, interns quietly packing up boxes. The collapse wasn't limited to finances. Inside Congress, the ripple effect spread like fire on dry grass. By the next week, committee hearings no longer revolved around Cruz's testimony. They revolved around what to do about the system that had allowed his deception to live so long unchecked. Lawmakers debated in urgent tones the creation of a new requirement: mandatory cognitive and health disclosures for senior officials. Some proposed annual exams, the results to be made public like tax returns. Others called for bipartisan oversight panels to verify the findings. The question was no longer just about Cruz, it was about the credibility of government itself. The arguments grew fierce. Supporters of transparency thundered, "If the president has to disclose medical exams, why not senators?" Critics fired back, calling it political theater. But the momentum was undeniable. The scandal had peeled back a curtain, and now the public demanded light. Polls taken in the aftermath showed 72% of Americans wanted stricter disclosure laws. Even some of Cruz's Republican colleagues quietly admitted on background, "He may have destroyed the trust for all of us." For the first time in decades, Congress wasn't just debating policy, it was debating trust in the very people who made it. Outside the Capitol dome, the American people divided into 2 furious camps. On one side were the die-hard loyalists who dismissed the video as another deep state trap. They shouted into microphones at rallies, waving signs that read, "Stand with Cruz." They filled conservative talk radio with rage, calling Jasmine Crockett a pawn of the establishment. For them, nothing could shake the myth of Cruz's genius. Every fact was twisted into fuel for their fire, but they were shrinking in number. The larger share of Americans felt betrayed, cut to the bone, by the revelation that a man who preached about values and truth had shoveled $5 million into silence. For them, the scandal wasn't just about one senator, it was personal. At diners in Ohio, at union halls in Michigan, at church basements in Texas, ordinary people shook their heads in disbelief. "He looked us in the eye and lied," one veteran told a reporter. "If he'll lie about this, what else has he lied about?" The question echoed across the country, a bitter refrain of disillusionment. The division spilled onto the streets. Protests formed outside Cruz's district office, signs declaring, "We deserve the truth," and "Stop the lies." Counter-protesters waved Cruz's face on posters, chanting, "Witch hunt." Police barricades became the new normal. Cable news ran split screens of the two camps shouting at each other. The American public literally divided down the street. The scandal wasn't just a headline, it had become a wound, and the wound kept bleeding. Academia wasted no time turning the chaos into a case study. At Georgetown, a professor of political ethics opened his lecture with the freeze frame of Cruz screaming into a microphone. "This," he said, "is what arrogance looks like in collapse." Harvard's Kennedy School assigned the scandal as part of its fall curriculum. Students dissecting how a myth of genius could survive for years before imploding in one night. Media schools replayed Jasmine Crockett's calm silence beside Cruz's rage, asking future journalists to consider how imagery can speak louder than words. Think tanks published papers within weeks, titling them with phrases like "The Price of Arrogance" and "When Myth Meets Reality." Analysts dissected every move, from Cruz's smirk to Jasmine's pause before closing the folder. They argued that the scandal represented a new chapter in American politics, one where performance could not withstand the brute force of evidence. Students debated whether the outcome would have been the same 20 years earlier, before social media could broadcast lies and truths side by side in real time. The media turned the hearing into a parable, a living allegory for the dangers of hubris. Documentaries rushed into production. Streaming platforms secured rights to exclusive footage. Late-night comedians branded it the $5 million IQ test, mocking Cruz while lauding Jasmine's composure. Scholars noted how quickly a single event had migrated from politics into culture, becoming both a warning and a punchline. And through it all, one truth hardened. This was no longer just about Ted Cruz. His personal implosion had triggered something larger, something systemic. Editorial boards wrote that the scandal was a mirror held up to every leader who believes power can outpace honesty. In op-eds across the nation, columnists warned that Cruz's fall was not an isolated failure. It was a symptom. The lesson, one wrote in The Atlantic, is not that Cruz lied, but that arrogance always assumes it can lie forever. Even within the party he once called home, the scandal became shorthand for disaster. Strategists muttered the phrase, "Don't Cruz yourself," as a warning to candidates who grew too cocky. Donors demanded new standards before writing checks. Behind closed doors, Republicans feared the fallout would haunt them for years, reshaping primaries and thinning loyalty. What had once been his boast an IQ of 170 had mutated into a national joke, a shorthand for delusion. The public had moved beyond shock to recognition. Cruz's downfall wasn't an accident. They realized it was inevitable. When arrogance builds the house, sooner or later, truth sets it on fire. And Jasmine Crockett, by simply standing firm with evidence in hand, had lit the match. The image of him screaming low IQ into a microphone while she sat calm and unshaken became the defining snapshot of the scandal. It was clipped, framed, and replayed until it no longer felt like news but like history etched into stone. By the end of the month, it was clear. This wasn't a Cruz story anymore. It was a cautionary tale for anyone who thought power could replace truth. Professors, pundits, and pastors alike repeated the warning. Build your career on arrogance, and one day the collapse will come. Cruz had become the example carved into the wall, the man who thought $5 million could buy silence, but instead bought his own destruction. His fall was more than personal. It was a warning shot to every leader watching. The roar of cameras had not yet died when Jasmine Crockett rose from her seat. The chamber, already straining with tension, quieted under the weight of her movement. She stood with the folder in her hand, the same folder that had carried proof, revelation, and devastation. The silence was not ordinary. It was reverent, the hush of a room waiting to hear the sentence after the verdict. Her eyes scanned the committee, then locked on the cameras, knowing that every word she spoke now would live forever on tape. She did not rush. She drew a slow breath and leaned into the microphone. Her voice was steady, clear, and unshaken. America does not need fake numbers, she said, her words sharp as glass. America needs the truth. America needs transparency. And America needs leaders who have the courage to admit their own limits. The sentences fell like hammer blows, each one punctuated by silence, each one swallowed by millions of viewers across the country. The press gallery exploded with the sound of fingers hammering keyboards, reporters racing to transcribe the lines as they left her lips. News producers whispered into headsets, "Mark that clip, cut it, package it, run it again at the top of the hour." Television screens flickered with instant captions. On social media, the quotes shot out like lightning bolts, ricocheting from phone to phone, turning her words into hashtags. Truth not numbers, transparency, limits of power. Cruz sat just feet away, but the distance felt like a chasm. His hands lay flat on the table now, drained of their fury. His eyes were glassy, the anger replaced by something heavier: resignation. For hours he had shouted, denied, attacked. But in this moment, he could not muster even a sound. The weight of her words pressed him down until the only thing left was stillness. He had entered the hearing wrapped in the myth of genius. He was leaving it stripped bare. Jasmine did not gloat. She did not need to. Her strength lay in restraint, in refusing to meet arrogance with arrogance. She paused, then closed the folder with the same decisive snap that had silenced the chamber before. The gesture was final, like a gavel. She placed the folder flat on the desk, her hand resting on it as though anchoring the truth to the wood. Then she stepped back from the microphone, her speech complete, her message delivered. The gavel struck from the chair to signal the end of the hearing, but it was Jasmine's words that truly closed it. In the gallery, members of the public exhaled audibly, some with relief, others with awe. Reporters surged to their feet, cameras rising to track her every move. The entire room seemed to shift its center of gravity toward her, pulled by the force of what had just been said. Cruz finally moved. Slowly, stiffly, he stood from his chair. His suit was wrinkled, his tie askew, his face pale under the lights. He gathered his papers in a fumbling motion, though there was nothing left to gather. Each shuffle of papers sounded hollow, empty. His eyes darted once toward Jasmine, then quickly away, as though contact itself might shatter him further. He turned toward the exit, his steps uneven, the cameras chasing him like hounds. The image was devastating. The man who had declared himself a genius with IQ 170 now walked out not as a victor, but as a husk. His jaw clenched, but his shoulders slumped. His lips moved, muttering to himself words the microphones didn't care to catch. The cameras had already chosen their shot, a fallen man, leaving in silence, surrounded by lenses capturing every crack in his mask. And then the room turned back to Jasmine. She rose from her chair fully now, the folder in her hand once more. The moment was cinematic, her figure framed by the glow of overhead lights, the press surging forward, microphones extended like weapons desperate to catch her words. She didn't rush through the crowd. She walked slowly, head high, her movements deliberate. Every step was a statement. Every flash of a camera sealed her image into history. The press swarmed, but she did not falter. Hands reached, questions fired, voices overlapping into chaos. "Congresswoman Crockett, what's next? Do you think Cruz should resign? Is this the end of his career?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she lifted the folder above the crowd, its leather surface catching the light, gleaming like a symbol. The flashes turned the moment into a strobe, illuminating her calm face against a storm of frenzy. For viewers at home, the contrast was unbearable in its clarity. Cruz had left the chamber with his head down, beaten, broken. Jasmine emerged into the same storm with her head high, her eyes unflinching, the folder aloft like a torch. The symbolism was obvious but powerful. Arrogance had collapsed, and truth had walked out standing tall. News anchors, scrambling in studios across the country, struggled to contain their awe. "This hearing will be remembered for that final image," one said breathlessly. Cruz leaving in silence, Crockett walking into the press with her head high. It's the ultimate split screen of arrogance versus integrity. Social media users flooded timelines with side-by-side photos. Cruz red-faced and crumbling, Jasmine radiant and calm. The captions needed no creativity. This is what leadership looks like. Truth wins. Academics watching live rushed to write down her words. The speech was already being hailed as a defining statement, one that would echo in classrooms and lectures for years. Commentators noted the simplicity of her language. No jargon, no complexity, just truth spoken plainly. It was the kind of rhetoric that pierced partisanship, that could not be spun away. Her lines would be remembered not just for what they said, but for when they were said at the exact moment the myth of genius collapsed. In the hours that followed, networks played the clip on a loop, the hearing condensed into a 30-second highlight reel. Jasmine's line, "America does not need fake numbers," her closing declaration, "Today, it ends," Cruz's broken expression, and finally the image of her walking through the press with the folder gleaming in her hand. Ratings broke records again that evening, analysts declaring the day a turning point in political history. But the story wasn't just in the numbers or the broadcasts. It was in the way people remembered it. In diners, people would recall where they were when they saw Cruz's face collapse on live TV. In classrooms, teachers would play the clip as an example of truth meeting arrogance. In sermons, pastors would quote Jasmine's words as a moral lesson. It wasn't just news, it had already become parable. And in the chamber itself, the energy lingered even after the crowds dispersed. Staffers whispered to one another, knowing they had witnessed something that would be written in history books. The smell of sweat and tension clung to the air, but over it all was the memory of one voice cutting clean through the noise. Jasmine Crockett had spoken not like a politician, but like a verdict. The last cameras followed her down the marble steps, flashes still blazing, reporters shouting questions that no longer mattered. She paused once, turning slightly to face the crowd. She did not smile, she did not wave. She simply held the folder higher, letting the symbol of truth gleam under the flood of light. The image was so sharp, so cinematic, that photographers would later say it looked staged, though it wasn't. It was reality, and reality was enough. Behind her, Ted Cruz slipped into a waiting car, his face half hidden behind tinted glass. The contrast was brutal. One walked into history, the other drove into obscurity. The broadcast cut on that split second the folder raised, the flashbulbs exploding, the look of composure etched into Jasmine's face, and with that, the story sealed itself. The lesson was clear to anyone who watched. Intelligence was never about numbers, never about false boasts. It was about integrity, about standing tall when arrogance crumbled. Jasmine Crockett had not only ended Cruz's illusion, she had rewritten the terms of what leadership meant. The flashes finally dimmed, the microphones sagged, and the last echoes of the gavel faded into a heavy electric quiet. The chamber felt like a stage after the curtain drop, hot lights cooling, dust hanging in the air, an audience unwilling to move because something larger than spectacle had just taken place. No one said it aloud, but everyone understood the shape of the moment. It was the kind of ending that does not ask for applause. It only asks for memory. And as the silence settled, the meaning settled with it, filling every seat and corridor like a tide that would not recede. What happened there did not unravel like policy or process. It detonated like an earthquake. The floorboards of certainty buckled, the old pillars of bravado cracked, and the false roof of legend caved in on itself. You could feel the aftershocks in the way people breathed, in the way they avoided one another's eyes, in the way headlines wrote themselves before hands could catch up. Truth had thumped the table harder than any fist, and the room learned what ground really felt like. When the ground is real, you stop stumbling. Chairs scraped back with the reluctant sound of defeat, and the long desks held the fingerprints of a fight that was finished before some realized it had begun. The air still shimmered with heat from the lights, but beneath it was a colder current, the chill of certainty. The microphones stood like empty sentries, their red lights finally dark, as if even they had heard enough. People stood, but nobody rushed. Victory and collapse both move slowly when they are undeniable. In that measured hush, the verdict required no translation. The image that remained was simple, brutal, and unforgettable. On one side of the memory, a man red-faced and loud, shouting at a storm that no longer belonged to him. On the other, a woman steady and unflinching, a folder in her hand, the light catching its edge like a seal. No score was needed, no narration required. Every living room understood the split screen without being told. History does not always come with trumpets. Sometimes it arrives with a camera flash in a closed folder. America does not need fake numbers. America needs the truth. America needs transparency. And America needs leaders who have the courage to admit their own limits. So on, the sentences already clipped and packaged by 1,000 screens had the clean cut of a blade and the endurance of a creed. They said what needed saying and then stopped, refusing to gild the lesson. Intelligence without integrity is just a costume, and costumes do not survive daylight. Arrogance always forgets that sound is not strength. It believes louder is truer, brighter is wiser, longer is deeper. It builds a throne out of echoes, then calls the echo-proof. But when evidence walks in, arrogance finds out what walls are made of. It discovers they are paper where it taught itself they were stone. The louder it yells, the thinner the paper feels. Truth does not sprint, it walks. It does not plead, it arrives. It does not mimic thunder, it opens a window. People do not always welcome it, but they recognize the air when it comes in, how it clears the room and makes the light seem less forgiving. What happened here was the simplest of exchanges, illusion traded for oxygen. For the men who have stacked lumber in the rain, who have fixed the furnace at midnight, who have watched a line of bills and figured out how to make the month work, this moment was built in a language they know. Numbers can be faked, but a level never lies. You set it down, the bubble moves, and the argument is finished. The folder worked like that level. It did not persuade, it settled. There is a particular quiet that follows a fair shot landed clean. It is not triumphal, it is exact. People pack their bags without talk because there is nothing left to say, nothing left to spin. Even the marble seems to listen, as if the building itself prefers honesty to performance. That is the quiet that hung in the chamber as the last cables were coiled and the last lenses capped. Outside those doors, the story would be clipped and looped and captioned until it was muscle memory. But the ending was already written on faces as they passed under the carved seal, some relieved, some crushed, some disciplined by the lesson without admitting they had learned it. The floor stopped shaking, and yet no one trusted it quite yet. That is how aftershocks work. They live in the nerves long after the wave has rolled through. And in those nerves, a warning took root. This is how the day closes. Not with a victory dance, but with the weight of what has been proven. Not with slogans, but with the bruise they cannot hide. Not with a final shout, but with a final image the folder lifted, the head held high, the truth refusing to blink. The camera does not chase noise at the end. It finds the stillness that remains when the noise has spent itself. And there, in that stillness, the lesson stands where anyone can see it. A country does not change in an hour, but it remembers in one. It remembers the moment the floor held, the second the story stopped being someone's performance and became everyone's fact. It remembers the look of a mask when it ceases to fit, and the look of a face that never needed one. It remembers that strength is not volume, it is verification. And verification is a quiet that does not wear out. No one needs to be told what to take from this, but the words belong on the record anyway. When the truth speaks, pretenders bow. When light is steady, shadows cannot negotiate. When evidence is plain, empires of posture come apart by themselves. A number shouted is not a measure of a mind. A signature shown is not a trick of sound. The day does not end with applause. It ends with a reckoning that fits in a sentence. The sentences were spoken already, and they will be spoken again, not because someone orders it, but because they ring true. America does not need fake numbers. America needs the truth. America needs transparency. And America needs leaders who have the courage to admit their own limits. The echo of those lines is not performance. It is policy for the soul. So the camera lingers for one last frame, because that is the mercy cameras can offer. It holds on the empty chair, the cooled microphone, the track of footsteps in the aisle. It holds on the seal above the dais, unblinking and indifferent, as if to remind everyone that walls outlast reputations. It holds and then it fades, and only then does the broadcast end. Call it a political earthquake if you need a headline. Call it a reckoning if you need a sermon. Call it a lesson if you need a classroom. Whatever the word, the physics are the same. Pretense collapses under proof. There is no exemption clause for the proud. And if anyone asks what the moral was, the chamber has already answered without moving its lips. Intelligence is not a number you can wave like a flag. It is a promise you either keep or break. Transparency is not a press release. It is a posture when the lights come on. Courage is not the roar. It is the nod when the facts are not your friends. That is what stays when the feed goes dark. The corridor is empty. The steps outside collect the last echoes of shoes. The night air is cooler than the lights, kinder than the microphones. The city will keep running. The sun will come up. The story will file itself into the hard drives and the minds that carry it. And somewhere, because of today, another performance will die before it is born. Here is how it ends and how it should end. A nation that has been shouted at remembers it prefers to be shown. A building that has heard every excuse decides it believes the paper. A crowd that came for a spectacle leaves with a standard. The earthquake is over. The landscape has changed. When truth speaks, arrogance bows. The silence after the political earthquake was not empty, it demanded a response. The cameras were still rolling, the flashes still sparking, and the weight of what had just unfolded pressed down on everyone watching. Jasmine Crockett knew this was more than an ending. It was a call to the millions of eyes locked on their screens. She leaned into the microphone one last time, her tone sharp and unyielding. If you care about truth, if you care about honesty and leadership, don't just watch act. Demand accountability. Demand transparency. Demand leaders who put integrity above arrogance. Her words rippled like shockwaves, straight through the chamber and into living rooms across the country. She didn't speak like a politician begging for applause. She spoke like a fighter daring the people to pick up the torch. This is your government. These are your leaders, and this is your moment to choose what you will tolerate. Don't let lies rule this nation. Stand up for truth, because when you stand, corruption falls. The gavel had ended the hearing, but Jasmine's words carried beyond it, hanging in the air like a command. This wasn't just history, it was a challenge, and it was now in the hands of the people watching. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.